Yuri Bezmenov was almost completely forgotten by many Americans. However, his insight into the goals and tactics used by the KGB at the height of the Cold War should be examined closely. The Cold War conjures up images of spy versus spy, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and proxy wars. That would just be examining the conflict from a superficial view. The real fight was social, cultural, and political at its core.
Only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия, to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
This chart of the subversion process, according to Bezmenov, warrants a closer look. The entire process of ideological subversion can be divided into four main steps. The first is demoralization. For this step in the process, 15 to 20 years are needed. According to Bezmenov, that is the amount of time required to educate a generation. Helping along the way are media and teachers who've become sympathetic, consciously or unconsciously, to the theoretical causes of the subverting nation. What follows next is destabilization. This is a 2 to 5 year period to change the country's foreign relations, defense, and economy. Culture is impacted and begins to reflect the new agenda that is supposed to be pushed as part of the subverting entity's larger goal of control. Push will lead to shove, and from here, we enter a period of crisis. Around 6 weeks to 6 months of chaos is a climactic turning point. People demand order from anyone who can bring it. The people who created the problem had already planned for the solution, which leads to normalization. This stage finalizes what the status quo looks like. Bezmenov's description of this phase includes military takeover and has no end. This phase lasts indefinitely, as the government begins to define what is normal. Political prisoners? Normal. Genocide? Normal. Total control? Normal. The most chilling statement he's made on the psychological damage that this process does is the one he discusses here.
Exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it. When a military boot crashes then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization.
Bezmenov claimed that the USSR was surprised at how easy demoralization took place in the United States, and that by the 1980s, the United States was well past the 20-year mark. If we follow the timeline he gave, we can see the beginning of the demoralization stage with McCarthy and other politicians of the time pushing back, and the beginnings of US involvement in proxy wars with Communist China and the USSR. Domestically, you had incidents at Kent State, the growing counterculture focused on the self, the fears of peak oil. The so-called war on drugs also began. The time was ripe, and in the 1980s, it seemed that all it would take was another little push to finally send the US over the edge. But it didn't.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
America persisted, and by the early 90s, the Berlin Wall was being broken into pieces. This is where many people began to see people like Bezmenov as alarmists, former spies making a living off selling fear. Stability and good times had returned, and outside of those with an enthusiasm for spies and politics, the name Bezmenov wouldn't be referenced outside of those circles for another 30 years.